Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Zerrin Yumak. I'm from the Department of Information and Computing Sciences at Utrecht University. And this is an event we are organizing about embodied AI, virtual humans and robots. And I'm organizing this event together with my colleagues, Martje de Graaf from also the Department of Information and Computing Sciences, though with a background on social sciences she has, and with Ruud Hortensius from Social and Behavioral Sciences from Utrecht University. So the goal of this event is to build community around virtual humans and robots, social robots. And this event is organized in connection with the human-centered AI focus area at Utrecht University, in connection with the special interest groups, autonomous intelligent systems, and social and cognitive modeling. Chris is doing this there. Yes. We are going to start with this first event, which is more focused on Utrecht University, but we will, as I mentioned, we will be following up with other events. So be prepared for that. There will be more activity on this topic in the coming days, months, all together, hopefully. Also including colleagues from other Dutch universities that are active in this area, or also internationally. So we like to really build a community, and we really realize that this topic is very cross-disciplinary. We need a lot of people from different backgrounds, from social sciences, from computer science, from humanities, arts. So it is a pretty broad topic, also combined with these topics on ethics and explainable AI, etc. in the last couple of years. So it's becoming a very, very important topic that requires people talking over like communication among different academics. Okay, so we have today a very interesting lineup of speakers. Our first speaker is, or panelist is Sven Nio-Loom. I hope I pronounce it correctly. So he's from the humanities faculty and working mainly on ethics of AI and robotics. Maaike Blikker, she's also working in the humanities faculty, focusing more on activities such as performing robots and arts. Johan Joring from the computer science department on software technology for conversational virtual agents. And Ronald Poppe working more on human behavior understanding with a focus on computer vision and machine learning algorithms. We will be accepting some questions from the audience as well. Please, if you have any questions as we go, type them and then raise your hand, and we will try to take them as much as possible. And the agenda for today is, after this introduction, I will keep it short. We will continue with some slides to make some concrete introduction to what each of these people are doing, including organizers and panelists. And after that, we will have a panel discussion of about 1 hour, and we will conclude our findings from these discussions. So let me start with sharing my slides. Okay. Can you see them well? Yeah, good. I see some people nodding. Okay, so we will start with some short pitch from everybody, me followed by Martje and Ruud, and then our 4 panelists. Myself, as I said, I'm in the computing sciences department in the human-centered computing group, and my research is on autonomous and interactive social behavior modeling for virtual humans and also robots, human-like robots in particular. So I'm working both on the algorithm development and also perception and evaluation of social behaviors. So my focus is making these characters interesting and enjoyable to interact with people. So that requires really a continuous interaction with the people, the algorithmic aspects, but also understanding the anthropomorphic aspects of virtual humans, robots, their affordances and constraints. So this is a really continuous loop. So how do I do that? I really look at different aspects such as algorithms and engineering, and that is already very interdisciplinary in the field of computer science, combining techniques from AI, robotics, graphics, animation, signal processing synthesis and effective computing, for example, combining techniques such as rule-based approach and lately data-driven machine learning, deep learning-based approach. But the theoretical grounding for this is really coming from other disciplines, such as social and behavioral sciences, humanities, arts, and also physics and biomechanics. So understanding how movement is working, but also how human cognition is working. And based on this theoretical grounding and algorithmic and engineering aspects, we have also this human aspects, which is evaluation of the algorithms, but the perception, but also the perception of the behaviors of virtual humans and robots. And the techniques for evaluation is mostly derived from HCI, human-computer interaction. And linked with these communities is also intelligent virtual agents community, HRI, human-robot interaction community, or even VR, virtual reality communities. So if you look at the big picture, to develop virtual humans and robots, you basically need the whole computer science department, and that is not enough. You also need other departments and faculties and a lot of knowledge. Myself, I have been focusing on 3 research lines. The first one is personalization and long-term social interaction. The second one is situated interactions in social settings, and the third one is social animation and non-verbal motion synthesis. So I want to give you some examples of this. The first one is about whether can we develop algorithms that can help people engage with robots and virtual humans in the long term. So often these interactions and these robotic platforms or virtual characters, they are interacting with people in short term, and it is kind of interesting, which is called the novelty effect. But how can we keep people interacting with them longer periods of time? Because we want these characters to be integrated in our lives. So my contribution on this was to the personalization aspect. So how can we give robots and virtual humans capabilities of emotions, unique, distinct personalities and memory, so that they can remember what they were talking to each individual people, and then remember their exchanges, in particular emotional exchanges, for the purpose of increasing social presence and task engagement, for example, in educational settings where the character is a tutor. The second aspect is situated interactions. So most of the interactions, they are traditionally focused on two-party screen-based virtual characters. So can we move this from this fixed environment to more populated environments such as airports, schools, where there are more people and the robots have to deal with interacting with groups of people? And here my contribution again was how to model engagement and to define, for example, if multiple people approaching the robot or the virtual character in a situated real environment like a virtual receptionist, can we detect the engagement level of people to initiate a conversation and to make the character decide which person is attending, and also managing the conversation once the conversation is starting, so the turn taking and generating the appropriate behaviors during this multi-party conversation. And finally, I'm working on mostly that is the part that I'm currently working at Utrecht University, and the other 2 was more before. Social animation and non-verbal motion synthesis. So here the question is, can we automatically generate non-verbal behaviors for real-time interaction for virtual humans and robots? So I want to mention here the real-time explicitly, because these are for, in particular for characters, believable characters in games, in virtual reality, where you still can have co-presence and collaboration with the human beings, and also humanoid robots, the robots that can have facial expressions, gestures, postural movements, etc. And the idea here is to automatically generate these behaviors so that they are responsive in real time. So I lately work a lot on machine learning, deep learning algorithms, for example, using audio, text, and music. Can we automatically generate emotion So you just type in audio or you just type in some text and give an audio or piece of music, and suddenly the character starts talking and playing an instrument, dancing, yeah, just use facial expressions and gestures automatically. And that a lot goes with capturing motion and generating behavior using this data. But the same principles can also be applied for robotic embodiments. So I think that is my pitch so far. We will have more chance to talk about more, yeah, let's say hot topics in the panel discussion. For now, I would like to give the floor to Martje.
Yes, thank you, Zarin. So yeah, so I focus on human-robot interaction. I'm also from the Department of Information and Computer Sciences, but I have actually a background in social sciences and communication science specifically. And my research approach, when I look at human-robot interaction, I fully focus on the human end of that. So I really study behavior of people while they are interacting with robots from a psychological perspective. And the approach basically that I'm taking here is based on the ABC model of attitudes. So this consists of an affective, behavioral, and cognitive opponent. So when we look at human-robot interaction, the affective component is basically people's emotional responses to robots. And then you have the behavioral component. So obviously you can also observe how people behave and show kind of nonverbal behaviors or even verbal behaviors during their interaction. And usually that is also a result of their attitudes towards robots. So for example, if you're more positive towards robots, you will see a more positive interaction, or if you're fearful of what robots can do or are a bit unsure about what will happen next in the interaction, you can all read that from a person's behavior while they're confronted with robots. And the last component, the cognitive one, that is more about people's beliefs, but also their prior knowledge about these systems, which is usually also based on the experiences we have from either movies or books, or even similar technologies that we have been using so far, like our smartphones, for example. People often draw on these experiences when they are faced with this new technology of robots. Can you do the next slide? Yeah, and then specifically the research topics that I am working on here in Utrecht is, for example, robots as intentional moral agents. So I'm very much interested in how we perceive the minds of robots. So because robots are autonomous and they are physically present in our world, people seem to think that robots can do much more than our computers. And what I think is really important to see where this actually is. So often right now, research is done with like this Likert scale on anthropomorphism, for example, and then people just fill in a number from 1 to 7, and that is how we measure this. But there's a much more fine-grained psychological cognitive process going on, and I want to unravel all these details about mind ascription. And then I'm also very much interested in norm violations. So I think one of the bigger challenges for robots is, now that they're coming out of the factories into our human social world, is that they have to deal with our human social systems. And we have developed very complex rules and like the way we are supposed to interact with each other. And now a robot has to learn to deal with that. Obviously, there are a lot of components here, but I've done some research in the past year, for example, what will happen when a robot violates our expectations, because usually we expect robots to be these perfect citizens and really be in service to us. But what happens when a robot cheats or lies, and how do people respond to that? That's how I would like to study these norm violations, or the way that robots will be introduced in our normative systems. And then obviously when we have to collaborate with robots on a daily basis, and something happens that violates our expectations or these norms, so to say, then the robot needs to have certain strategies to repair the trust that is probably broken based on these norm violations. So yeah, we need to know more about the ways that robots could reconciliate these trusts. And then, of course, there's also the other side. We have seen, I think 2 years ago now, for example, that there was this hitchhiking robot traveling around the world. But then, unfortunately, it decided, or it came to the US, and then it was destroyed by people. So yeah, we somehow we can design robots to respond or behave or say something to at least make sure that well, they are not destroyed. Some call it mistreatment or bullying, although that is already anthropomorphizing these machines. And then I also know that there are studies out there about discrimination towards robots. There have been studies done on racism specifically, but I've done, for example, studies in the past year in which we see that gendered robots are dehumanized. So that is also one of the angles that I'm taking under this label. And then the last one is about explainability, a very hot topic, as Sarah already said. But based on the two previous topics, I believe that we can really learn and use what they call folk psychology. So that's basically how our human minds work, and with the mind ascriptions that we put into these systems, we can use this mechanism that we are using very naturally. We can use the same mechanism, I believe, to make robotic systems more explainable and more understandable and intuitive in the interactions. And that will, for example, make sure that we can have the right amount of trust in these systems, and also make sure that the mind ascriptions that we do, that they are sort of accurate towards what the system actually can do. So that is, I think, a summary of my research here in Utrecht.
Thank you, Martje. Okay, continue with Ruud.
All right. Hello, everyone. Very excited to be here. My name is Ruud Hortensius, and I'm a relatively new assistant professor in the Department of Social Health and Organizational Psychology here at Utrecht. So trained as a social neuroscientist, I focus on how social cognition, the process that allows us to live these rich and social lives, is affected by interactions with social AI, for example, robots. So I particularly focus on how long-term engagement with social robots impact distinct aspects of social cognition. For example, emotion or empathy, reward, trust, but also social learning. To do so, I make use of neuroimaging and behavioral observations to map how the representation of social cognition changes over time. So, for example, I ask people to spend 5 days with a small robot in their home, and then measure brain responses before and after this interaction. Thereby asking questions if you can feel empathy for a robot to the same extent as you can feel empathy for a human. Or can you recognize the emotions of a robot? Or even can you understand the intentions of this robot? And by focusing on distinct aspects of social cognition, this research will allow to investigate the building blocks of social cognition during human-robot interaction. So how do these interactions with social robots shape everyday aspects of social cognition? So how do these free flow interactions in the real world impact aspects of social cognition. So to do that, I asked people to team up with a robot and try to understand the psychological forces that come into play during these collaborations during human-robot teams. So, for example, how do they impact joint decision-making? Are similar social dynamics at play when you make decisions with a robot? And are you influenced by the decisions of a robot? It really allows us to understand the psychological forces that drive these collaborations. But ultimately, my goal is to bring together these findings and study robot-to-human behavioral transfer in the real world. How does the emotion of a robot influence your emotion? And can we use this to change behavior in humans? So leveraging techniques from social neuroscientists, psychology, and robotics, and insights from lab-based experiments, real-world interactions, but also intervention at the home, will allow to understand our social lives in the age of robots and algorithms, and really use that to influence and change behavior, ultimately. All right, so that's what I'm trying to do here at Utrecht.
Okay, so thank you, Ruud. We continue with the next speaker. But I think you need to give back the control to me.
I have done that, yeah.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Yes. We continue with Sven.
All right, thanks very much. So when I introduce my topic to people who are not familiar with this, I always like to show this picture because here we have two very well-known individuals. Of course, Merkel on the right, and then Sophia the robot in the middle, and the person on the left, I have no idea who she is. But 2017 having been a very successful year for Sophia in many respects, getting to meet world leaders, appearing on TV shows, speaking in front of audiences of like the UN and other important places. So on the one hand, this was a very successful year, but on the other hand, Sophia was also criticized very harshly by a lot of people, including people like us, whether it's computer scientists or ethicists or others. They felt that it was disingenuous to present Sophia as if this was a much more intelligent robot than it really was. That people like Merkel, if they take selfies with a robot like this, give the wrong impression of just how advanced such a robot is, and that it would be better to treat this not like a human, but like a machine. But on the other hand, it seems almost impossible for people not to get sort of carried away and want to do that sort of thing, because indeed it's fun, and like if a robot talks to you, it's hard not to sort of respond to it. So yes, I think that's a really nice picture to kind of introduce the topic that, of course, for this audience, one doesn't really have to introduce. Okay, let's go to the next slide. I mean, in a way, I could say that when it comes to what I'm working on, I could almost say that I could just take whatever, especially Martje said, and just say that I work on the philosophical and ethical aspects of all those questions. Indeed, when I was writing the book, Humans and Robots, that's on the very right there, I drew very heavily actually on a lot of Martje's research, and so I discuss it in about 2 or 3 of the chapters. And let me just say something quick about how I approach the interaction between humans and robots from a philosophical point of view in that book. I took inspiration actually from 2 other books, namely the ones that you see on the left. So both, one is a philosophy book and one is a book about law. And so the one that's called Unfit for the Future by Ingmar Persson and Julian Savulescu argues that we live in the modern world with our modern technologies, but equipped with sort of a psychology, a mind that was shaped over a very long period of human evolution, most of which did not involve living in the modern world with modern technologies. And so we may be, in certain respects, not necessarily ideally equipped when it comes to our psychology and our minds in terms of how we respond to the kind of modern society we live in and with the modern technologies that we have. They don't discuss robots and AI very much in that book. They talk more about technologies that cause climate change and living in huge societies rather than small tribes, etc. So from that book, I took on board this idea that we're sort of facing the modern world with minds that developed before we had things such as modern society, and I add robots and AI. Jacob Turner, in his book about robots, talks about the law. And his sort of guiding thesis is that our legal systems and frameworks developed before we had robots and AI. For example, laws regulating driving assume that there's always a human driver. And so now we have development of self-driving cars where there's supposed to be a driver-less car, as the expression sometimes is. That means that our legal system is not well prepared for dealing with the new, well, not reality yet, but attempt to develop this new reality of driver-less cars. And so what I take from that book is the idea that, well, the same thing is the case with respect to our ethical frameworks. Our main ethical theories in philosophy and our main sort of commonsensical ways of thinking about ethics all also sort of developed before we had robots and AI. And again, now we do have robots and AI, so we have to try to think about how can we extend our ideas about ethics and philosophy to this new world with robots and AI. And so those ideas are sort of the starting point in my own research about this. And then I go on for the rest of my own book about this topic to talk about, well, actually, so a lot of the things that were already mentioned before. Can we collaborate? So Rud was talking about human robot or human machine collaboration. What does that mean for human responsibility? Let's say that the robot is doing most of the actual work, so to speak, and the human acts as a supervisor or a kind of, I don't know, manager, something like that. Well, actually, it turns out that if you think about this, we already have ideas about human-human collaboration where maybe one human is doing most of the work, but a commander, let's say, is responsible. So we do have things that can be extended into the world of human-robot interaction and the ethics of that, but it may require certain conceptual innovations, and it may require introducing certain types of concepts, such as something that's not quite a person but looks a little bit like a person and is designed to act as one and to make people react to it as if it were a person. So I think our current ways of thinking give us a lot of groundwork, so to speak, but for the ethics of these things, innovations are also required, and so that actually makes it quite exciting to think about the ethical issues to do with this. And in general, of course, we should try to adjust and adapt robots and AI so that they fit with how we humans work. But I'm also curious about the idea of whether there are any circumstances where it might be a good idea to actually try to change the way that we behave and think so that we are more compatible with robots, if it could be in certain circumstances to our benefit. And maybe the last thing I will say is that I actually think the self-driving car may be an interesting case where that could be so, because the attempt is to develop a more optimal form of driving. And we've already seen in some of the accidents involving humans and self-driving cars that humans sort of assume that self-driving cars are going to be behaving like human-driven cars behave. And this is part of what has caused some of the crashes. And then some people have said that, well, let's just make the self-driving cars drive like humans so that they can fit in better. But that would, in a way, undermine the whole idea of trying to create a more optimal form of driving. So the question might be in a case like this, whether in order to be allowed to still drive your normal human-driven car, perhaps you have to try to drive more like a more optimal robotic driver. You might ask, how could that be done? Well, maybe with something like an alcohol lock or speed limiting technologies, etc. But it's an interesting question, because we typically think, of course, and I think rightly, that we should adjust the robots to us, but it's interesting to think also about whether there are any circumstances where we should also somehow adapt to the robots that we are creating. And so that's one of the topics that I'm quite interested in. And maybe the very last thing I should say is that on March 1st, I'm going to have a new PhD student starting at the university, who will be working with me on the topic of the ethics of humanoid robots. And so in future meetings, this group here, I'm sure that it would be nice to include her, and she could tell you about, she already did a very thorough master's thesis about this down in South Africa, where she's joining us from. So she already has a head start, and I think she's going to be an interesting contributor to this group here at the university. And her name is Cindy Friedman, I should also mention. So thanks a lot.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Sven. Yes, so we continue with Johan Euring.
Okay. So I come from an educational background, you might say here. That so 8 years ago, communication teachers from pharmacy and medicine and veterinary medicine, psychology came to me and said, okay, we want to develop a serious game in which our students can practice communication skills. So I had a number of student groups trying to look into this, and together we developed an environment in which our Utrecht University students could practice communication skills. And this is a screenshot of the simulation, and it's relatively simple, you might say. It's you get a number of multiple choice options, and you click your way through a conversation, and the virtual character there, she moves, so she has gestures, emotion. There's some lip syncing going on. It's become much better through the years, but it's still I guess it may be state of the art, but we're not doing actual research there. And the interesting thing here I found was, how can we kind of ensure that we make things that teachers want to use, but still try to offer as much as possible flexibility and try to use some of the AI technologies to be able to increase, say, expressivity, increase believability, etc. So maybe you can go to the next slide. So, I made it bullet for bullet. Anyway. So what you see here is a scripted scenario, and there are a couple of expressive scripting constructs. So you can have phases in a scenario, the dialogue, and you can interleave the various phases, and you can go from one to another, etc. So that's flexible enough. If you go to the next bullet, so we started at Utrecht, but since there was an interest from outside the university, we started the company that's now exploiting the software. And actually it has almost 20,000 users now, so it's doing quite well. And there's, I think, maybe, so you can practice these scenarios here, giving feedback, giving bad news, motivational discussion. There's loads of these models, you might say, that teachers want to practice. Well, we have more than 1,000 of those in the database already. Yeah. So it was working, and we used it in teaching. But now, of course, you get the question: can we extend it so that, from a maybe closer to research perspective, can we maybe use agent-based languages to, instead of scripting the dialogue, to have an agent responding to sentences from a user, and so try to detect the meaning of what a user says, and based on that meaning respond. Well, we've had some students looking into this. It's I would say it's interesting, but pretty disastrous from a user perspective. So no teacher wants to use this. And the other thing is open text input. So instead of having a multiple choice dialogue where each time you, through selecting a choice, you go to the next choice, you can type in open texts. So again, here we performed several experiments. And again, interesting from a research perspective, but pretty disastrous from a usability perspective, because the kind of believability of the agent became much less. So this was kind of using AI techniques to try to increase flexibility, you might say, or make it more like a real human, the responses. The other thing we looked at is can we, in various ways, look at the quality of these kinds of dialogues when students converse with these virtual characters. Can we see how well the students are learning the kind of dialogue they need to learn, how good the dialogues are from a kind of test-based perspective. So something we did rather recently is looking at, okay, so if we look at these questions, these dialogues as multiple choice tests, what can we say about scoring? What can we look at item discrimination? So if is an item that students answer, do good students answer the item well, and do students that are not so well that do less good, do they score less on these items too? Or item difficulty, so how difficult are the items? What are the options that are never chosen? But also if we have these hundreds of students playing these scenarios, we can check the reliability of the various scenarios and the internal consistency. So we try to look at many of these aspects, and it's clearly not ready yet, but from a kind of test theory perspective, there's lots of interesting data to look at now too. Okay, so this is all I wanted to say about it for now.
Okay, great. Thanks, Johan. So we continue with Maaike, performing robots.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Maaike Bleker, and I'm a professor of theater and performance in the Department of Media and Culture Studies, so the humanities. So my background is not in computing, AI, or robotics, but I approach robotics and AI from the perspective of theater, and I collaborate with robot developers in the development of robot behavior and human-robot interaction. Theater, dance, and performance offer a wealth of knowledge and expertise, one might say, about designing behavior, staging behavior, giving shape to behavior, communication, interaction. There's a lot of knowledge about animating inanimate objects, but also about things that were mentioned before, like situatedness of interaction, the relationships between actions and how they're interpreted in context, sets. There's a lot of knowledge about movement and motion-based interaction, and also this notion of continuous interaction and how to develop that over time, and how to kind of developing characters over time. Theater and dance and performance also have a lot to offer with regards to creative methods of developing such behavior, interaction, and communication, as well as methods for analyzing, interpreting the results of such staging behavior. And what's also quite nice is that quite some theater and dance and performance makers like to experiment with possibilities of new technologies of all kinds. There's a whole history of theater makers doing that, including robots and AI. And the theater is also a very interesting place to try out things in a kind of contained setting, and also with audiences. So in my work, I collaborated with theater makers that are interested in trying out these things, and with robot developers to see how theater, what of the expertise and knowledge from the theater can be made productive in what way for the development of social robots. So theater in my work is a means for development and experiment. It's not the end goal per se, although sometimes that's part of it. But in the end, the goal is to contribute to development of robots that operate outside the theater as well, in everyday life, one might say. I've started doing this in international projects, mainly in Australia, where quite to my surprise, originally was asked to participate in several applications for research projects for developing social robots. And yeah, I had never thought of that before, but I was there asked for my expertise in dance and movement communication, in nonverbal communication, and analysis of all kinds of situations and interaction within situations. And this project made me really curious. So I've been, from there I've started to investigate and discovered that, at various places in the world, this interaction between robots and theater is happening, and various aspects of the theater are being explored for their potential. So from 2017, I've been building research and organizing events in Utrecht that try to bring together these various elements of the theater and robots. So try to make connections between what's happening in different places and work out what that can bring. And one of the events that we did here was the conference Performing Robots in 2019, where we had people from all over the globe who were presenting their projects and their research. So that was a very interesting kind of coming together of a lot of elements. And here on the slide is a project by an Utrecht-based theater maker, Dries Verhoeven, who did this project called Happiness. It's now touring also internationally. That was intended to be part of the conference, but his robot was not finished in time. So in the end, the whole project was postponed and premiered later on, but it is somehow part of the longer term research still, although the original performance took place a bit later than the conference for which it was intended. Can you give my next slide? Yeah, so one of the things that we do under this broader label Performing Robots is this research project Acting Like a Robot. This is an NWO funded project that is a collaboration between theater at our university and then robotics from the Vrije Universiteit en Hogeschool voor de Kunsten in Utrecht and the theater company Ulrike Kwade Company. And the theater festival here also in Utrecht. And in this project we try this is kind of very concretely trying out, so we have collected all this information about various ways in which theater and robotics have been brought together or are being brought together in places around the world. And what we do in this project is test out elements of that knowledge, kind of build on that knowledge to see and bring together what can we use and what is useful in what way from theater, dance, and very broadly the performing arts in developing various aspects of robots in different contexts. In this project we collaborate with projects that are like robots that are being developed for various concrete contexts. So like a shop attendant, and a robot for in the classroom, a robot for the eye film museum. And so these projects are running. We don't initiate these projects ourselves, but we enter these projects, we become part of them in order to see how we can contribute to what is being developed from various aspects of expertise from the theater. So we see what can we use to improve what is being developed, particularly in this context, or how can we contribute to work towards the aim of this particular robot in this particular context. And this is often usually there is some kind of basic verbal communication, but where our contributions seem to come in is very much the non-verbal communication, or also the communicative aspects of the very presence of the robot. So how is the robot present within a situation, spatially, but also in terms of this ongoing presence of an entity there, of how the robot traverses space, and other aspects of nonverbal communication. And verbal communication is part of it, but it is interestingly not the main thing so far. So in that project, we work with this particular object theater maker, Ulrike Kwade. So she is some people would traditionally call it puppet theater, but it's much broader than the kind of classical puppets. She really animates objects as actors, and I think that's a really interesting expertise also for animating robots, to start thinking also from their particular embodiment, from their particular way of being, their possibilities for doing things, and see how from there one might start thinking about how one might act like a robot, and instead of developing the acting of the robots by means of mimicking already existing ways of acting of, for example, humans. Questions there are also how to avoid cliches and stereotyping, for example, and still be recognizable. And also, and that was interesting what was just brought up, indeed also the question, maybe could it be that robots will also change our way of communicating, or will new ways of communicating develop from interacting with robots? And one might say that a lot of our communication has co-evolved as a result of the kind of technologies that we use. So it would not be surprising if we also develop new approaches or take new steps in the development of our modes of communicating based on what the possibilities are with robots. And part of that does not so much happen yet in the case studies that we're doing, but next to them we do also more experimental work in performative settings, where we can kind of extrapolate possibilities and go more into kind of experimental further developments of where we might go or what we might want to further explore. Just to round up, I mean, this project also has, this particular project has one PhD student, and we have a second PhD student also around working on robots and theater. So I think they would also be really interested in being part of events in the time to come. We have Ruo Wen Hu, and she's doing a wonderful project on thinking about technology and the development of robots and vulnerability. And Irene Akubila Trugton is the PhD project that's part of the Acting Like a Robot project, and she's working on movement in particular, movement as a part of robot behavior and human-robot interaction. And I'm very happy also that we will in this spring do an online event together with the Spring Festival. So I will take care that you all get the announcements. That is very much part of our attempts to build networks between robot developers and theater makers, to bring them together and see what possibilities for further development are there. And we will also collaborate with artist Bram Ellens, who is going to do a huge project on robots in captivity in an arts and culture space called Doornburg, where we will be kind of present for 4 months and experiment with various robots and their possibilities for behavior. So I'll also take care that you get the announcements and can see if that's interesting for you to join at moments. But I think this is what I have to share here right now.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Maaike. So we continue with our last pitch from Ronald Popeye.
I used to be a black slide, but that's fine. Thanks for the invitation. My name is Ronald Popeye. I'm in the Department of Information and Computing Sciences in the Social and Effective Computing group. So there's lots of text here, but it's actually in white. So maybe I can just, no, it doesn't work as well. So I'll just explain what it says here. Hoppa, there we go. So the group, and in particular also my research, is on computational analysis of human behavior. In particular, I look at how people use their bodies, and that's really from a sensing point of view. So a lot of interest in how people see certain things, and we try to replicate this ability for computers. So apart from just measuring, so basically understanding of just seeing how the movement is over time, we also try to interpret it, right? So we try to understand what is going on in terms of the actions, the intentions, but also the relations if there's multiple parties involved. So a lot of my research is focusing on the interactive context, and this interactive context can be anything, right? So the images here are a couple of projects I've been working on. So on the top is a project with the Dutch police, where we really try to understand what a person is doing, right? In this case, Sven, you should be happy about it, because we're actually trying to make humans behave more like robots by making sure they're not looking at their smartphones and not calling in the car. So this is now operational. And the second image is our research on deception detection. So when people are lying or not. This was an experiment that we did in the Nemo Science Museum a little over a year ago, where we really look at individual behavior, but also about how people interact with each other. Right? So we know that they're mutually influencing each other, so we really measure those kind of behaviors as well. And on the bottom, what you can see is a couple of kids playing on what we term the interactive playground. So this is basically a play space where kids can exert themselves, but in a very interactive way. So you see these circles projected on the floor. And at the same time, this system also doubles as a research database. Right? So we can understand what kind of behavior people, so in this case, kids perform, but we can also analyze other properties, such as if people know each other, do they exhibit different types of play behavior, etc. So the challenges in my research basically focus on two things, and the first one is the measurement. So when we use sensors, in my case, typically those are cameras, the measurement is really the quantitative analysis of what is going on. So this video was supposed to move, and you can see the yellow dots here. Those are the facial feature points. These are the points that you can identify in the image. And finding those is an objective task. So humans can do it, and if you ask two people to do it, they will maybe not completely agree, but there will be very much agreement in where they would place those yellow dots. So it's an objective thing to do, and that means that it's also very suitable for automated measurement. Right? So we use computer vision and machine learning technology, and increasingly we do that with deep neural networks. So, and if we have controlled setting, meaning that there is not too much distraction, that we can fully observe the people and their emotions, then we have relatively good results also in real-time processing. So these techniques are, well, basically ready to use in interactive systems, such as virtual humans and social robots. So the second challenge comes from the interpretation. That's much harder because it's a qualitative process, right? So it's very subjective typically, and we are looking at properties such as, for example, if you look at these two ladies, is this a friendly conversation, right? So it's much harder to say something about it because you need to know, wait, are these friends? Well, if they are, then how are their movements exactly related? They're sitting really close by each other. Is that simply because they are friends, or is it because some experimenter said that they had to sit there? So context is very important to understand exactly what's going in. So the interactive behavior in particular has a challenge because we always coordinate our behavior in terms of the behavior of the other. Right? So there's always a feedback loop. We see what the other do, we adapt our behavior, and we do this continuously. Right? There's always mutual adaptation. So people can very easily interrupt each other. If we look at our interactions, these are never turn-based. It's not that someone does something and then says, okay, now respond to me. Okay, now it never works like that. So there's always continuous adaptation there. And if you then translate that to automated interpretation, I think Johan put it as, let me It's interesting, but disastrous. I think I put it nicely by saying only in a limited interactive context. So if we know a lot about the context, right? So if we know exactly who's whom, there's a specific task at hand, then it works. A multimodal approach has seemed promising, but other than that, there is a lot of uncharted territory there, which also has a lot of consequences when we build technologies for virtual humans and social robots. So those were my slides, so thanks.
Great, thanks a lot, Ronald. Okay, so I will stop sharing the slides now. And we can see each other better now again, I guess. So yeah, thanks very much. It was very interesting to see first to get the gist of what everybody is doing. And that already gives an idea of how interdisciplinary and how there are different topics and different perspectives. So now for this next part of this event, we would like to a little bit zoom out. So to have a higher point of view and how we can communicate with each other around these topics. So we are a little bit ahead of time, but I think it's not a big problem. I think we can go a little bit freely on the next questions. I would like to start with the first question, so feel free to just take the floor, and if you have an idea about this question, speak up. If nobody speaks up, of course I can pick and you can take the floor. Okay, so the first question is about really for landing to this topic, landing into this topic. What is embodiment? Why do we need embodied AI, or do we need at all embodiment? And maybe a question related with that is there are different forms of embodiments. We were talking about virtual embodiments and physical embodiments. And what are the differences and advantages, disadvantages, or the context that they are useful? And what is the point of view of different people on these different virtual embodiments? Like how do you see that? And the effect of these different embodiments on people? Okay, anybody wants to start?
I have at least some experience from communicate and dialogue trainer. So when we started, somebody came in who wanted to join the project, and he had developed a similar kind of application with a very cartoonesque person, and his view was, well, it doesn't really matter as long as it has eyes and a mouth and well, maybe some movements here and there, then it's good enough. So he was the one started the company, and now he's the one pushing more realistic characters all the time. So he left that position, but I think he had a case in a way. I mean, it's what you see in all these games too, right? Minecraft is terrible, but apparently people still have these characters walking around there, consisting of blocks, and so basically I'm asking the question back. So why are we working so hard on trying to make this embodiment more advanced, lip syncing, more realistic gestures? How much does it matter?
Well, I completely agree with you that probably the effectiveness is not necessarily a matter of it being realist or naturalist or looking like something we already know. But I would say that embodiment matters even if it's totally non-realist. I mean, that's maybe from my perspective from the theater. It always matters what is expressing the language or the behavior. But I do think there's often assumed that that there is only one way of making that function, and that is making it mimicking something that we already know. And and that's the effectiveness, whereas there is indeed so much expertise in the arts of animating things that are not looking at all like something we already know, and they're extremely effective. So then still the embodiment matters, but not necessarily the kind of copying what's already known.
An interesting case here that maybe goes a little bit in the other direction than what Johan talked about is the robot Casper, that probably a lot of people know about. That's experimental treatment of children with autism, where I think the idea is that the robot shouldn't look too similar to a sort of regular human, because that then becomes overwhelming for these children, and so a simplified version of a sort of a boy, I guess it's supposed to look like, will work better in that particular context. So that's an interesting case with people who find normal social interaction overwhelming with humans, who are offered this simplified human in the form of a Casper the robot as a kind of, I don't know, gateway to enter into social interaction with strangers. So that's an interesting case just to have in also as part of the ingredients that we're talking about.
Yeah, maybe to summarize it a little bit, it a little bit depends on the context. It depends on what you are doing and what is the application, what you are aiming for. Often there's this distinction of co-presence, where you have the social presence with virtual characters, but then there is this co-location, sharing a physical location together. You can do it in VR in a simulated way, but with robots in the real world, right? So it a little bit depends what you are doing in the game world, because it is kind of this realism and believability is pushed. People start to get used to this kind of nice renderings and really pushing the boundaries of computer graphics. So it really depends on what you are doing. If you are dealing with teaching children something in a particular context, maybe it's a different story. In games, it's a different story. In VR, it's a different story, I think.
But it's also important what you want to convey, right? So if you have very realistic embodiment, then people also expect that all the other functions, such as communication and sensing, are also much more sophisticated. So if there's not a balance there, then you typically have a robot that doesn't do its job probably very well. So if you have a very simple robot that can just communicate what it needs to communicate and nothing more, in whichever way, could be very human-like or not human-like at all. But if that's understood well, I think the robot can perfectly function for the tasks that it's been designed for. But for example, what we all seen this the Santa movie. It was a movie that was made just completely with motion capture and face capturing. It looked very realistic, but then the animations were not so realistic, and it looks really awkward. The same for a lot of robots. I remember,
Express, for example.
Polar Express, exactly, that was the one. But there was also the iCat. This has been quite a lot of years ago. There was a yellow cat that was designed by Philips that you could put on your desk, and it could talk. So, and then the idea was that, well, if it can talk, it can also listen. But speech recognition technology was terrible in those days. So you could talk to the cat, it would never understand what you were saying. So it was really awkward. Whereas if it could only blink and just do nothing, then people would probably be very happy with it, because, yeah, well, they had a cat in their home. So I think embodiment really needs to be as functional, as elaborate as what you want to convey with it.
Yes. Well, I think maybe following up with this question is, like, there is this perception aspect, but there are also a lot of technical challenges. There should be kind of a balance between what we want to achieve, the task, but also how we can do that. So if I mentioned in one of my slides at the beginning that you need the whole computer science department to develop a robot from scratch, and there are a lot of things that you need to do, like computer vision, natural language processing, multimodal understanding, multimodal synthesis understanding, modeling cognitive functions, motion synthesis. A lot of things are needed, and each component is already very challenging. So I want to a little bit hear how different disciplines see these challenges. And how does it reflect in your work, how you do things? And maybe linked to that is also a little bit of a deeper discussion. Some of you perhaps respond. There is this different ways of doing things, which is called symbolic AI, sub-symbolic AI, or heuristic rule-based approach, or data-driven, mostly bottom-up approach, which is the ones that are mostly done recently. So what do you think about these more technical challenges? Anyone wants to speak, or shall I? Yes, Ronald.
Yeah, I'll take this one.
Being the technical person.
Yeah, I thought you were looking at me, but I couldn't try to see because of this embodiment of the videos. So I think this is very relevant, but also very difficult question. So that might be, and it's not too popular to answer it. What I have experienced is, so I think at this point, there is no way you can truly model an interaction, I think, in terms of cognitive states, in terms of effects. So you're always, if you're building interactive systems, you're always finding shortcuts, right? So you're always trying to put in some idle behaviors or trick behaviors that you can put in if you sense a certain type of input. Or, well, probably Johan knows a lot about this because, well, you can't have full animations for all the virtual characters, but still they need to do something, right, in order to appear believable. So I think it's always difficult, but I think you always need a combination between, well, full-fledged AI, symbolic, and just the tricks, I think.
Can I just, because you said, Zarin, that you need like the whole computer science department, but I think Maaike would argue that you need arts or like perspectives from the arts, right? And also I think that ties into what Sven said, that like what categories are robots anyway, right? And I think like how do we see robots and how do we envision like robots? What should they look like? So maybe like we have to step outside of the computer or like psychology department and like talk to artists and designers to really think of how social AI or embodied AI should look like, right? So maybe that's a different perspective.
Yeah, definitely. Then it is more treating these embodiments more like a interaction design component. But I guess that doesn't really take away the other components. That's because we need everything, basically, and depends on what we are doing, in which context what we are doing and what we are aiming for. But for example, in the case of Maaike, how are you dealing with the technical challenges? From your point of view, does your work contribute to the technical challenges as well, or do you learn something from technical challenges, or are they things that are not so easy to tackle for you? What is it in your case?
Well, as I said, for me, of course, the technical is not the starting point because that's not where I was trained. So my expertise is both in the practice and the theory of all kinds of performances. I encounter the challenges, of course, through the collaborations because, when we were collaborating on trying to make something work and make something happen, of course, I encounter then also the technical challenges, but these are not the ones that I solve by technical means. So often my work is also trying to rethink, well, if this is where we are, or if this is what is possible, how can we deal with that? And so my way of approaching, and that's maybe also what makes the collaboration very interesting, is that I'm often also working with much more from what is already possible, or where is the limit, and where do we, maybe there is a possibility of developing that further at some point, but at this moment we deal with that limit. So is there a way of just thinking about it differently? So often, and that brings me also maybe to what I often see as an interesting challenge that comes up within the collaboration, is to think differently about developing. So often an artistic approach to developing something is often not this is what we want, how do we get there? But it is, what do we have and how can we play with that? And how can we go for the limits of what is possible with this? How can we improvise with it? How can we experiment with it? And how can we sometimes come up with communication in ways that works very well, but was not kind of envisaged beforehand and programmed towards that? So I guess that's often the productivity, is also the very different perspectives on how do you develop things, or how do you even organize a creative process of designing something. So that's more what I encounter, or how I encounter the challenges, I guess.
Okay, so I guess time-wise, we have to move to other questions. We have several questions that we'd like to address. Now I want to give the floor to Martje to manage that part of this discussion. There will be topics on AI, ethics, explainable AI, and this kind of topics. So please, Martje, go ahead.
But there's also a question for Martje in the chat, or.
Yes, I will read that in the meantime, and then I can translate it while she's asking the other questions, I think.
Okay, so I can just go on with what we decided, and you will manage. Okay, great.
Yes.
So yeah, the next topic is more about the ethical debates that are currently going on with robots becoming more social. You get these things like relationships that we develop, like attachment to robots. Robots become maybe responsible for their actions if they're autonomous, or at least the question becomes like, who is accountable if something goes wrong? Can a robot be a moral agent? So lots of ethical questions are going on here. So basically the main question is then like, what is the current state here? What is, according to your fields, but also more specifically, like how can we study these ethical questions? Because often ethical debates are, for me, I'm not a philosopher, but they're usually done on a more philosophical, discussion based without any actual data. And then, we do this Wizard of Oz studies because robots are not smart enough, or we use, like scenario-based surveys. Is this an appropriate way to study these ethical questions? So please, I would like to know your opinions and expertise on this.
Well, maybe I can jump in first, since I do come from the Ethics Institute of the university. And I mean, I should mention that Marty you did write one philosophy paper that was actually quite good about philosophy of human robot friendships. You're a philosopher. I mean, one interesting development that I've seen is that as philosophers, we've been very much joined by computer scientists in recent last 5 years, say, as in the role of ethicists. So quite a few people come from that direction into the domain of the ethics of this. And it's kind of interesting to observe the trends, because to me, it seems quite common that they are much more attentive, obviously, to the technical side of things than those of us who were already in ethics and coming from this from a humanities point of view. And for example, worries about social robots being deceptive, worries about anthropomorphism being sort of seen as a bad thing. Those tend to come very much from people who move from computer science into the ethics of this robots and AI, social robots topic. Whereas people who maybe come from a less technical side may very well worry about this, but maybe less so, perhaps because we have a less good understanding of the technical difficulties with actually building well-functioning robots. But that's just an interesting trend I've noticed. And especially this idea of the more human-like, people will think that the robot has capabilities that it doesn't actually have and may end up being deceived. That's a very commonly described worry from computer scientists who turn into ethicists.
Yes, yeah. Of course, I'm familiar with that debate, and there are even scholars out there that we just shouldn't anthropomorphize robots, which I, as a psychologist, say, well, that's impossible because that's how our brain works. So I personally don't think that's the solution either. So how do, a more like Ronald, for example, or you are more from the technical background. How do you view this?
What I find very interesting is that a lot of, so I think you're right, Sven, that there is an increased interest for ethics from computer scientists. And I think it has partly to do because robots is like a gateway. It feels that people talk very specifically about robots and then they realize, oh, but these are systems, these are autonomous systems. Oh, but yeah, so they have a very special role, I think, in both from a technical point of view, but also from a societal point of view. But I think a lot of the issues, ethical issues that we discuss specifically for robots should be discussed at a much larger scale. For example, if you talk about self-driving cars, these are not considered robots. But I think a lot of functionality and a lot of the impact they can have on the real world is exactly the same as for a humanoid robot that walks with you on the street or helps elderly people in the hospital. So I think it's very important that just by focusing on robots that tend to be more human, we are now looking more broadly at, okay, what kind of stuff are we developing in a more broader sense? And I think that's very interesting. And also, for me, these questions are very difficult. So I tend to stay away from the more societal questions, and it seems like dodging my responsibility, but that's I have very good reasons. We can debate about that later. But I think it's important to realize that for me, robots are not so special compared to all the other technology that we also develop for very different forms.
Great, but yeah, then basically the next question that I already introduced, like how can we empirically research these ethical questions? Because that's also something I'm struggling with personally. I would like to, perform experiments, but still linking or contribute to the philosophical discussions and still, exploring how to do that properly and what is the best way to do that.
I mean, I certainly have opinions about this, but I spoke just a moment ago, so maybe I should give the floor to someone else first. The short, boring answer, I think, is sort of working together in interdisciplinary teams. And I mean, I have some good experience with this, working with organizational psychologists about robots in the workplace. I mean, primarily in logistics warehouses. There, of course, the robots do not look like humans, but like boxes or arms sticking out from the wall, etc. But it's interesting to think about this both from the very theoretical, philosophical point of view, but also interview people working with the robots or thinking about this from a psychology point of view. So, my quick short answer would be working together in interdisciplinary teams tends to generate interesting results. And I think you have done that to some extent, Mark. Is that not so?
Yeah, Chris kind of mentioned something in the chat, so I would kind of agree with this comment as well. Like the user studies often comes at the end. You don't think about these things from the beginning, and having in mind already what kind of product, like approaching is more like a product design from the beginning. I guess that would be, as you said, when combining this effort and having again interdisciplinary approach right from the beginning is important.
But I think that's difficult, right? Because you are dealing with expectations that people have. So I think the latest studies you've been doing, Maatje, were really asking how people would feel in a specific situation, right? So it was hypothetical, and people would have to think, okay, so the robot would do this, what would I do, right? And then you're very strongly dependent on what people think the robots can do, how we'll do it. So I think that it's still quite difficult to do this beforehand. So I think it's important that the evaluation should be earlier than at the very end. But I will be very wary of already trying to gauge all this without fully knowing how it would look in practice. I think otherwise we would get stuck with the views that we had back in the 50s about robots. And it was, I think, predominantly that they would steal our jobs and destroy the planet. So I think right now we have a much more positive outlook. So I think it's good that we also continue developing those robots, even though at that point we should say, well, if they're going to destroy the planet.
Well, although those two
maybe.
words are often still expressed by both lay people and experts.
It also connects a bit to what Mike just said about the view on development. So if you look at artists, take what's there and try to use it in many different kinds of ways. Maybe the developer has never thought of using it in that way. Whereas computer scientists develop things, right? They think they can create things, so they develop them in the way they think they can create them. And maybe they sometimes think a bit less about how, in the end, people are going to use this. Maybe they should, but well, then people start using things in ways you would never have thought people would use it, and often that's a good thing. Sometimes it's a bad thing. I mean, to come back to the communicator, the dialogue trainer case. So we developed this for students to practice these conversational skills, but then other people started using it by developing the scenarios and discussing the scenarios. Entirely different. I mean, they were never seen as a goal in itself, but then people used it as a goal. So it's very hard to predict how people are in the end going to use the technologies you develop. And you have to think about this, of course, but you can't pre-imagine everything you're going to develop, I think.
Yeah, I have spoken with people who have more like a design background, and they can do this special technique of like futurist thinking or design thinking methods. So yeah, that sounds really interesting. But I'm also wondering, to go back to Mike, like the theater background, because there's also like using imagination in plays and stuff. Could that also be an interesting direction to sort of, design these possible futures with humans and robots coexisting, and maybe in that sort of way trying to explore these future scenarios and their ethical consequences or questions?
Yeah, absolutely. And that happens, I think, both in visual arts and in theater. And that's, of course, a different type of investigation of the ethical implications than taking an actual group of users and test out. This is more kind of imagining implications and taking and speculate on futures. So it's a kind of speculative practical philosophy in that sense. But that's indeed also part of our Acting Like a Robot project. So apart from the actual case studies and more experimental workshops, we have Ulrike Kwade creating a performance in which she will, that will be about a future with robots. We don't know exactly what aspect of it, because that's also a little bit part of the creative way of working. You can point in a certain direction, but artists also need freedom to extrapolate from ideas and see where they go. So, but that is part of it, and there are more artists doing that. And in a way, Bram Ellens is doing that, the artist that we will work with in spring. But also other artists have been doing that. And sometimes that's really just exploring the possibility of a particular technology to do something. Sometimes it's a real philosophy about what it will mean to live in a future with robots. And also the project of my PhD student, Ru Wen, is to a large extent about that kind of examples, about theater performances that imagine a future of living with robots. Yeah.
Okay, so time-wise, I think we have to move to the really last part of this session. I would like to give the floor to Ruud to really wrap up and ask the final questions. What we are doing in Utrecht, and what are the possible maybe applications? Or I give the floor to you, Ruud.
Right. Okay. So there are like only 2 short questions left, which are very broad. So the first question is really like trying to explore how we can use these new technologies in society, right? So how can they become part, as we say in all our grant applications, how can they be part of our everyday life? So I think like members of the panel have great examples of application in education and healthcare, but also what are the business aspects and possibilities thereof. And I actually want to ask Ronald to reflect, because he was dodging the bullet 2 questions back, because you're working, collaborating with the police, and I think there are some like very interesting thoughts to say about that.
Yeah, so this is more of a sensing technology in general. I think let me put firstly, we always do this very responsibly, right? So we're not doing anything that would remotely be unethical. So that's a little bit of a cheap answer, as it's Sven grinning. But I think there's so basically we develop technology that can do stuff that humans can also do, right? So at least in these type of collaborations. I think the main challenge for robots is very different, right? So I work on only the sensing part, but whenever I develop interactive systems, you get the whole feedback loop. And that makes everything more difficult, right? Because you can optimize the sensing, you can just use it exactly where it performs well, and then you're done, right? But if you're dealing with the whole interaction, all the parts in your system need to be good enough, and they need to work together, well, like clockwork, right? Otherwise, you have nothing left. So that means that when I look around and see where robots, virtual humans, or interactive systems in general are being applied to, it's very much niche, where you can always reduce the where you can always put some limits on what to expect in terms of the input, in terms of the output, or in terms of the complexity of the processing. And I think that's very important to do that. And I think we hop from niche to niche, and every niche is getting a little bit more extended and expanded. So I think Johan would know exactly. There's probably a plan how to build the next step and get a little bit further and see a little bit further and see if we can address this now. And hopefully in 10 steps, you have automated speech recognition in there. They can actually select answers, and maybe 10 steps after that, you can maybe also recognize something in the voice or put something back. And I think it's all these tiny little steps that are almost niches of themselves. It takes a lot of effort to move one step further, because all the components still have to work together.
Yeah, right. So Johan, so I wrote down that you first started with the application of the dialogue trainer, for example, and then only research came later. So you would argue that you have to like a very clear user case at the start, and then slowly become much more complex.
Well, for this particular case, yes. I think if you really want to use this in practice, you need something that really works, and that's where you start. I think, I mean, from a research perspective, of course, you can. You're not limited by this kind of application requirement. But I see Ronald's remark. I mean, like speech recognition is actually good enough now. So we can add speech recognition to the tool, and then, well, it's already in there actually. People can speak the sentence they choose, and then it's chosen for them. So that's good enough. But then recognizing if somebody says something else, what that means, that's not at all good enough. But on the other hand, of course, you can. I mean, it would be people. A lot of people are doing research on that area, and that's very useful research. And once they're far enough, I hope we can use that to include in what we're developing. I think the main thing we've been looking at from a research perspective is much more the kind of architecture we use behind the application. How does the editor work together with the player? How can we combine and integrate all these various components that we need to deal with? How can we configure them? So that's really the software technology where I come from.
Yeah, all right. I think given time that we have to move on to the last question to really wrap it up okay, so we have heard from different perspectives. So how do we move forward? So we know that there's, I think, a different line of research around the university. So where are we at the moment, and how do we strengthen our position, and what are the challenges and opportunities in this? So maybe Mike or Sven, you can comment on this first.
Well, just really quick before Mike says something more substantial. I mean, I think this event here is a really good first step. Yeah, I mean, from what I understand, there are some similar events planned, as you said at the beginning, maybe with people also from the outside, yeah. But this is certainly one good first step. And so maybe over to you, Mike. Yeah.
I'm not sure I have more substantial things to say, because I think I find it really inspiring to hear about what others are doing and to start seeing where potential connections might be. I wouldn't be able now in a minute to, you know, just repeat what that is, but I know that that I right away think, oh, I would like to talk to this person a bit more to see how these connections could work out. I'd like to talk to that person to see. And it's good to know also when something comes up where you suddenly think, here are people I could collaborate with in a project like that. So maybe it's too early to say already, like, this is how we should position ourselves in Utrecht, but I think it's a really good start in working towards that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think most of us would argue for like a bottom-up approach to really see, like, to get to know everyone, and then for new opportunities that arise, that you can connect people with one another. Ronald, Johan, any final comments on this?
Yeah, I would say you're completely right. And I think there's so many different angles, and it was very interesting to see which ones can be joined as a collaboration.
Yeah, no, definitely. So the future event will be more an event focused on the entire country, and then the event thereafter would be more international. So I think we're trying to slowly make it bigger and bigger. But I think also the PhD students can really drive this collaboration between the departments as well, right? Because they have the most time, and they're very excited all the time. So I think, yeah, master students, PhD students, undergrads, all the students, they can really drive these collaborations and shared projects indeed, all under an umbrella of human-centered AI, of course. So I think there's a nice infrastructure to facilitate this. Zairan, Maartje, any final thoughts on this?
Maartje, go ahead if you have.
No, I don't think necessarily. Like, indeed, this what we want to establish is, you know, to position Utrecht, that we are doing this kind of research in our next meetings, to make sure that we communicate this is what Utrecht is offering or doing. And indeed, very nice to know more about what you all are doing and how we can connect in certain ways. Yes, definitely.
Yeah, from my side also, I cannot add more than this. I think it's really like slowly we start talking more to each other and try to understand what we are doing. It's already very interesting, this journey, even though it doesn't turn to something immediately, which is very difficult, of course. But yeah, knowing our ambitions and who we are and talking more to each other is already a very good step. Having said that, I would like to thank everybody for contributing to this first event. Yeah, there are some questions in the chat, but for now I'm going to stop this recording, and we can continue in discussions informally after that, and answering the questions from the audience as well. So once again, thanks very much, everybody, and yeah, have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.